Uh, it's a pleasure to be here today, and wish Caprice had, because I've always enjoyed listening to Caprice. So this panel is going to be, and panelists, why don't you come up as I introduce you? It's sort of, so we've seen a lot of cool technologies, and so how do we get them in the classroom in an effective and integrated way, as Jeremy just said. So how can the state support innovation and experimentation and the effective use of new technologies? That's what we're going to explore. And each of our panelists will speak for 3 to 5 minutes, and we'll have questions. And a reminder that you have pads before you, so you can ask your questions. Raise your hand, and Bob and Bill and others from SVEF will be here. And let me just give a shout out to Kathy Barron, who is my co-writer on toped.org, Thoughts on Public Education. Kathy, are you here? Oh, she has been. So panelists, come up, please, and I will introduce. We have one surprise panelist who's not on your sheet before you, and one is Mike Kirst, is president of the State Board and professor emeritus of Education and Business Administration at Stanford, a position he also held in the first Brown administration. He's also co-author of the weighted student formula, which is now before the legislature, which would change the way schools are funded. Most importantly, he has the ear of Jerry Brown, although it's great discussion among the chattering classes how much Jerry listens to him. That's a topic for another day. And Rick Miller is superintendent of the Riverside Unified School District. Rick, come on up. And which is truly an innovator in technology and online learning in California. Rick has been an educator for more than 40 years, including superintendent for 23. He has been a teacher and principal at the elementary and secondary levels. He is also a principal behind the California Student Bill of Rights, an online education initiative that's proposed for November, and perhaps we'll get into that a little bit today. Pat Sabo is an 8th grade algebra teacher and math development chair at Healdsburg's Junior High. She's been teaching for 34 years and is a member of a CTA teacher evaluation work group. And she also has served on the committee for adoption of the National Common Core Standards. And our fourth panelist is Jerry Shelton. And Jerry is Vice President of Education Policy at School Innovations and Advocacy, which is a Sacramento-based education consulting firm. And it's a position he just took several months ago. Before that, many of you will probably know he was Chief Education Consultant to the California State Assembly. And for more than a decade before that, he held a variety of positions in the California Department of Education, including CDE's Chief Finance Officer, where he had responsibility over developing the state budget as well as fiscal policy and education finance. So, panelists, why don't you speak for max of 5 minutes each and just either reflect on what you've heard or share some other thoughts. Please, Mike, why don't you go first?
Well, this has been a really rich day of information, and I very much appreciate being here. I was on the state board in 1982, and one of the things I noticed as I came back in 2010 was in 1982, we were really getting there. I thought we had 3 classrooms in the back of the room, and then I came back in 2010, and most of the classrooms that I saw, I didn't see a representative sample. There were 3 computers in the back of the room and a computer lab. So not much had changed. I was really struck by that, although I had been out before that. So I think we have a big job ahead of us. I think also in the morning we heard about the need from Ted Mitchell, what he called changing the grammar of classrooms. Other people have called it the DNA of classrooms around technology. And let me make some comments on the context first. We've had digital textbooks from the major publishers for years. I've talked to them. They said it's a minuscule part of their sales, and that one of the major problems that they see is that the schools don't have the broadband to really accommodate their texts. Whether handheld devices will change all that, I don't know, but they see a big problem there. So that, I think, is penetrating the everyday use, the way the last speaker had of the parts coming together, and changing that DNA of the classroom, I think will be hard. The state has been doing some things. We have approved, for example, CK-12 is adopted by the State Board of Education. We have an organization run by the Stanislaus County of Education called CLRN, CLearn, and they have their website. I'm just looking at it again. They have reviewed digital materials under criteria as to how they align with California standards and many other qualities. And not much of that website is used, and I think in many cases not much of the materials have been sold in California as you would think. So we have both a school problem, and I suspect we have a marketing problem from our vendors we heard from. I used to teach a business course on business opportunities in education at Stanford Business Cycle, and we all ran into what's called a sales cycle. How do you get the materials out there? The big publishers have big outfits of sales to work with, and so there seems to be a problem of better marketing of these materials, if you will, in addition to the normal educational issues. Quickly, I'll mention some policies. First of all, I think what I heard was we need some systems to verify what digital math tools raise achievement. The PACE paper, which you got when you came in of these reviews of various materials, which I thought was very useful, very few of these materials they listed in there have undergone any scientific trials as to whether they actually raise student achievement. So I don't know how that's going to happen, but I think it needs to happen. Second, I did hear, and I totally agree, Phil Darrow say that the instructional materials adoption process in California, it should be a thing of the past. We need a much more aggressive policy that's demand-driven from the bottom with quicker turnarounds. Our current schedule is to adopt English language arts curriculum in 2018. The Common Core test is supposed to be in 2014-15. So we really need a total overhaul of that. We need changes in state regulations that inhibit use of digital materials. We still have things about required pupil-teacher ratios and treat this area like we do independent study of the old days. There wasn't much talk about the cost and teacher time of professional development. We all know our schools are stretched in that regard. I was surprised there was no discussion of virtual charter schools. That's one of the things we do in the board is approve or oversee charter schools. K12.com has 94,000 students now, lesson every day. Does that, or can we learn anything from them? Are they relevant to this conversation? And finally, everybody claims they're aligned to the Common Core. How do we sort out who's aligned and who's sort of just saying it? That'll be very important over the long run.
Good. Thanks, Mike. It's nice to see how you've added to the load of the State Board in your short comments. Rick, why don't you go next?
Thank you. Well, I'm going to try to break this down in a couple of different areas. First of all, in terms of technology, I think that oftentimes we miss the boat. This is not about technology. This is about learning. And we have to remember that our teachers are absolutely key. And I think many of our teachers are well prepared to deal with the issue, but we need to give them the freedom to go where they need to go and then be accountable for the outcome. The other thing is that the way we've looked at this, at least as a district, is we think this is really about the doing, not about the talking. And sometimes we plan until time is ended and we still haven't done anything. In our case, we have deployed over 10,000 mobile devices with our students. We're very student-centric about that. That is, it's in their hands. We expect them to take them home. We expect them to utilize those 24 hours a day and give them back to us at the end of the year. And we found that that's to be is very effective. I won't talk really about the algebra piece because I believe in algebra, I believe in it in 8th grade, but I think there's been plenty of discussion about that today. We have partnered with a number of folks in this process. We have partnered specifically with K-12 or CK-12, Intelligent Papers, and Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and many of you are probably aware of the results that we had with that particular product. One of the things that I guess astounds me and astounds us is that we have worldwide, entire countries going to one-to-one deployment of technology. And at the same time, we can't allow cell phones in our classrooms. And cell phones, by the way, you might think it's to answer the phone. Cell phones are really devices to respond to the teacher. And if we use Poll Everywhere, we can find out and check understanding very quickly, as an example, using that kind of technology that's right there. And so the concept of BYOD, bring your own device, is very powerful nationwide. We think we need to look at that. At the same time, we think there's a concept called BYON, bring your own network, because that's what students do. When they bring their iPhones or Droid devices or whatever they might have, they are essentially bringing their own network to school with them. We have found that, at least for we've done some things wrong, by the way, and Jeremy was talking about this earlier. You get negative results. We need to be mindful of that. One of those things was we need to move to being student-centric. When the student owns and operates that device, it makes a huge impact. At least that's been our observation, and we've seen growth in learning as a result of that. It also is interesting that there's recent reports out that California, even though we've been the center of innovation, the center of Silicon Valley and the like, we are actually last nationally relative to this topic of digital with our schools. And we need to reverse that, and reverse that quickly. In terms of policy implications, I think we here in California need to tool up for the 21st century. Our students already have. We just ask them to power down when they come to school. We need to reimagine our system itself. And I listened to a number of the speakers, and I can concur that we need to think about this differently. And part of it is we need to be held accountable for the outcome, not the how and not the compliance. And recently, actually, we was with Dr. Kirst, and he was talking about that, and I appreciated the direction he was going as a state. We need higher standards statewide because we live in a global economy and in a global society, and we're going to have to respond to that. We need to be talking about funding based on competence, not based on seat time. And that's probably controversial, but I have students that have gone through, for example, algebra for 4 years, almost a full load, 1 full year of funding, and they still are not competent in algebra. There's something wrong with that plan. And so we're looking at how to do that differently. Certainly the adoption process needs to be looked at. It needs to be much more timely. Some of the more recent adoptions in social studies tells us that Bill Clinton is the president. We think that that's out of whack. We would encourage equity of opportunity across the state, also support for innovation and outcome rather than just focusing on control and compliance. And we would hope that, as an example, the state would look at creating pilots or looking at how can we go out and actually do innovation and use that as a proof of concept to say either that works for us or that doesn't work, and what are the elements that are engaged in that. So the state needs to have an incubation kind of process to move us and move us very, very rapidly, because at this point we think we're behind in that transaction, and we're looking forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Pat, would you like to share some thoughts?
Well, I think there are advantages to be the last panel of the day. You're all awake, right? My name is Pat Sabo. I am in my 35th year in the classroom. I've taught 8th grade all 35 years, and it has been algebra, and within the last 12 years also including AVID. Little background information regarding my school, Healdsburg Junior High School. We have more than 50% of our students are second language learners, and more than 50% are socioeconomically disadvantaged. We've been a PI school. Interesting thing, during that rating as a program improvement school, we became a California Distinguished School. Go figure. I am speaking as a classroom teacher, and I'm also speaking as a member of the California Teachers Association. It is the belief of CTA to use computer technology effectively in the classroom. We must plan carefully in cooperation with all affected members and elements of our school community, that we train well and on a continuing basis, that we provide technical support, that we budget consistently for the long term and in amounts that are sufficient to cover the actual needs, and that we integrate technology into curriculum delivery, and that we are continuously evaluating our materials and outcome. There are three critical issues for this. The issues are access, application, and what I call the reality gap. So when we talk about access, I'll give you a few numbers here from the California Department of Education. Approximately 10,223 schools in California, public schools in California, with an enrollment of 6.2 million students. Number of computers, 1.5 million, with an average then of 4.12 computer per student. Okay? Now, of those, 62% of the computers in the classroom are more than 3 years old. 14% are 2 to 3. 13% is 1 year old, leaving us 11% that are less than a year old. Access. In discussing with any teacher in the state of California, if you spoke to them regarding access, you would get a varied degree of responses as to what access means. In one school, perhaps in Chico, access might be my students get 1 hour a week. If you go to a more lucrative school district, daily access, integrated into curriculum. Which leads us then into, if we have this much of a variance throughout the state, what do we have that's common? There are common best practices for application, and we have to address those, because that's from which we build. So if we look at these common best practices that allow us to apply this technology, we're looking at plan first, implement later. Provide staff development. Train teachers specifically in the use of technology in delivering those curriculum. Provide technical support in technology. Don't have your teachers be the ones who are also doing the technical support. Bring in technical people to be the support providers. And select assessment and instructional technology that defines appropriate uses to meet the needs of students. As a classroom teacher, I know that the needs of my second language learners is different than my English-only learners. I know that students in my classroom who have special needs are going to need something a little bit different than my students who do not require those special needs. And then this thirdly then brings us to what I'm calling the reality gap. The reality gap, what the state and local education agencies say we are going to do and what we are prepared to do. They are truly two different things. So if you look back at the statistics that I gave you, the 4.12 average computers per student. I go to my district alone, 420 students. What we have access to are 60 laptops that are on portable roll-ins that teachers can check out and allow their students. That becomes a 7-to-1 ratio, okay? As an aside, let me throw out there, the district did not provide these computers. These were done by an education foundation. So that becomes also another reality when we're talking about setting policy. So whatever it is that we determine to do policy-wise, I think the bottom line becomes the following. Do not set policies that are these ideals that cannot be met. They've got to be practical, and you've got to talk to people that are on sites and involved in day-to-day workings with our students. So I'm going to leave it at that, allowing more time perhaps for questions, and thank you.
Finally, Jerry, share your thoughts from many different angles that you've had over the years.
Thank you, John. Over the last couple of months, I've found it very liberating to be introduced as the former chief consultant to the Assembly Education Committee for a couple of reasons. One, because everybody still thinks I know something about what's going on, but I don't have to look over my shoulder to see whether my elected official bosses are listening to what I say. It's also been liberating because I've spent a lot of my career being one of those people that says, that's really difficult to do, or that's going to cost too much money, and things like that. So I decided today to kind of break away from that career habit and talk a little bit more optimistically about opportunities. Because really right now, we have some great opportunities, kind of a conflux of situations that's happening on the policy, on policy issues that will allow folks, I think, to move forward in terms of infusing technology into curriculum, instruction, instructional materials with respect to middle grades math. For example, the legislature is going through a reawakening of sorts, rediscovering that, in fact, curriculum and instruction issues exist in education. They've been away from that for a long time. This started to a certain extent with the authorization for the adoption of the Common Core Standards in early 2010. Last year, the legislature enacted 2 bills that I think are pretty important, SB 140 by Alan Lowenthal, chair of the Senate Education Committee, that set up authorization for adoption of instructional materials that would bridge the gap from where we are right now to the Common Core Standards. And AB 250, authored by Julia Brownlee, the chair of the Assembly Education Committee, that basically restarts the curriculum frameworks process. We've been doing nothing in terms of moving forward with either revising or adopting new curriculum frameworks for a long time. Ms. Brownlee also has a bill that's pending in the legislature right now, and it really addresses some things that Mike mentioned briefly, and that is reforming the instructional material adoption process. And with an eye towards streamlining that process, more local input, local control over adoption of materials. Secondly, we now have a governor who also recognizes that curriculum and instruction exists. We did not have that for some time. And I think perhaps we can thank Mike for some of that focus of the current governor. The governor signed the bills, those 2 bills that I mentioned before. The governor is empowering the State Board of Education and Department of Education to do more work in terms of curriculum instruction. And the governor, if you caught the State of the State address, talked, I think, significantly about moving forward and making changes in the state testing program, streamlining that program and reforming it in general. We're also looking at some other situations. We have Esea Reauthorization, which is going to be done when? I can't, 4 years ago, no, 3, no, 2, next year maybe. And of course, we're also looking at the work that's being done by the National Assessments Consortia that's going to be very significant, developing assessments aligned to the Common Core, Both of the efforts, I think, significantly that are going on, both of the consortia, are using technology in terms of delivering the assessments. The Smarter Balance consortia that California is participating in is actually looking at computer adaptive testing as an approach. And of course, we know that to a certain extent, testing, drives the instruction. And so I think it's significant that there are technology, implications for these testing systems. Now, all these things that I'm talking about, none of them directly infuse technology into the classroom or into instruction. But I think all of them provide an opportunity for all of you to give input into this process. Right now, the Department of Education is looking for reviewers of instructional materials pursuant to the Lowenthal bill that I mentioned. Fairly soon the State Board of Education and the department will be looking at people to be involved in the development of curriculum frameworks. Right? We all can participate in making our feelings known to the legislature, to Congress, and to the governor. And I think the burden is on us to take a hold of these opportunities that exist right now for things restarting and work together to move forward in terms of taking the next step of incorporating technology into our instruction. Thank you.
Great. So let me ask a couple questions before turning to those of yours. And this is a technology panel, but I can't, now that you're on the hot spot, Mike, I can't help going back to a previous topic. So just you. And what are the chances that California will adopt the Common Core as originally designed rather than cramming algebra back into 8th grade, sort of? Going back to the last panel, and then we'll turn to technology.
There's no current proposal that I know of to go back, change what was adopted in 2010 regarding the 8th grade algebra issue. And so the legislature hasn't, I don't see any bills in the legislature at this point. So nothing is on the foreseeable horizon to do that. There is one way to handle this, which is off the top of my head, is that we would use as our basic test a test aligned to the National Common Core, but allow students, and with some guidelines, I assume, to take the current CST algebra exam in 8th grade. So I don't know that it is absolutely essential that we go back and redo it, and it, of course, would open up the math wars, I would assume, in another round. But I think there's ways to do it without, with allowing the optional 2-track system.
Good, thanks. Is this coming up on the agenda any time this year, as far as you know? What to do with 8th grade math?
I would think it would be probably next year. We'd have to see more what the Smarter Balanced assessment comes up with, and more details on what that looks like.
Okay, thanks. So, Rick, you heard Pat give the rather dreary statistics of computers per student and how ancient they are and how there's no technology help. So I wonder if, given Chromebooks for $300 and software developing for mobile and for cell phones, whether you have a different perspective on where technology is headed, as far as is there a way of making it accessible in the schools?
Well, from our perspective, very much so. If we had to do what we're doing today 2 years ago, it would be impossible. It would be beyond what we can handle financially. Basically, what we're doing for devices at this point probably typically would be about $200 per device, and there's a variety of devices. We see ourselves as being device agnostic, so some are Apple, some are Androids, etc. And so that's how we can expand and deploy to that level. And it also covers a lot of other issues relative to support and warranty and all the follow-along pieces. because when you really look at what's happened within particularly the last 2 years, there's been a tremendous change, and we are trying to leverage that.
So Mike, and I guess Jerry as well, Pat, you can answer too. So particularly Mike, since the focus now is on flexibility, giving districts more flexibility and control of the spending, and to base the judgments on accountability, how they do, however we measure them, tests or like. So I'm wondering whether the same principle should apply to blended and online learning. So as we adopt perhaps a different perspective on seat time, or something like Rocketship that has its learning lab but still has to meet the minimum required time before classes, should they be allowed to change the rules and we judge them on the other side, or are there certain measurements that that we go too far? I mean, where do you decide where that flexibility will go towards blended learning and online, if at all?
I think I'm glad you made the point that one of the governor's priorities is to rethink the balance between state and local control in education in California. And indeed, he's doing a lot of realignment of moving things down to counties that are non-education, prisons moving down out of the state prison system for youth down to county facilities. So this is a general theme. And so I think more of these decisions then would and should be made at the local level, and there'll be more flexibility. I think on the blended learning issues and all of that, I mentioned that briefly, we still have some regulations that regulate class size, minutes before teachers and things of that sort. And so I think that the future will be to deregulate that, and it'll be more favorable to various kinds and modalities of integrating technology into classrooms. So I think the issue, I think, won't be with the executive branch, might be more with the legislature. So Jerry might comment on this.
Jerry?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest issues really that we're facing, especially when it comes to hybrid learning models or online instruction, is not so much an accountability issue in terms of student performance or compliance or something like that. It actually is integral to the school finance system that we have, and that is that the primary basis for funding in schools is attendance. It's attendance driven, average daily attendance, and the definitions that we have of attendance in statute right now basically, in a simplified version, means the students sitting in the chair in the classroom. Right? And there are very few situations where we move outside of that model. We do in charter schools, we do in individualized instruction programs and independent study, things like that. But for the most part, a student has to be sitting in the chair in the classroom with a certificated instructor who's an employee of the school district in order to count that attendance for funding purposes. And that's something that we really have to look at changing. The minority of the states in the country, base their funding on average daily attendance or something like it. The majority of the states base it on more of an enrollment count. And of course, if we move to an enrollment count, then you simply could have students in hybrid models. It wouldn't matter whether they were sitting in the classroom or sitting at home online. They would still be enrolled and still be generating funding for the school.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Just a couple of things in regards to that. It's very obvious that we really do have to rethink how California schools operate. One of the things that CTA would ask everyone to make sure that we keep in mind is the fact that there's always going to be equal access for all of our kids. And the fact that as a classroom teacher, we have to be very, very careful that we don't align ourselves to that singular type of a model. I mean, the interaction between a child and a teacher is immeasurable. And I think that if we're going to really start looking at these things, let's play it out fully and see what happens before we make those types of decisions.
Yeah, Rick, One of the reasons for the online initiative is that I think you felt some frustration getting the legislature to make some fundamental changes that you think are necessary along those lines. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the obstacles that you've seen and also some of the legitimate concerns that they may have about, you know, the wild, wild west of online learning in California?
Well, I think that our perspective is that Sacramento as well as D.C. has been fairly well polarized, and so we end up with paralysis as part of what's happening. Beyond that, we think that there's some real equity issues and access issues that Tony and his panel talked about earlier, and one of the statistics we use out of a UCLA study is about 1 million kids don't appear to have access to the A to G curriculum that gives them access either into the UC system or the CSU system. And we think that needs to be addressed. That's a civil right from our perspective, and that's not to take anything away from what our teachers are doing or those kinds of issues. That's a separate issue. But we've focused around that particular piece. But yeah, overall, we think that there's been too much polarization. From my personal perspective, I don't represent anybody other than myself, I think that the funding probably needs to some kind of an outcome basis. And I don't think that's problematic for our teachers or for us. It's just a different system than where we've been before. Because right now, as school districts, what's the one thing we pay attention to? It's whether or not the kid's in attendance. In fact, we have organizations out there that say they'll help us improve our attendance. Not that we'll help improve learning, we'll help improve our attendance. And yet this is an economic issue for our state that if we don't get learning right, if we don't get education right, we're not going anyplace. And so we need to collectively start figuring out solutions, and I hope Sacramento engages in that. I've been encouraged, frankly, by some of the actions the governor has taken, as well as the state board, but we're kind of trying to catch up for a lot of lost time.
Yeah. I have a question. As we move towards more collaboration between technology companies and the publishers of instructional materials, as recently announced by Apple, will the State Board of Education publish a policy that all core instructional resources must be multi-platform for universal access? Any thoughts on that, Mike?
No, I hadn't really thought about it. I don't think we ought to necessarily have to mandate it. I mean, I hadn't thought about mandating it in any way. The era of mandates is being pulled back, and when you mandate something, then you have to pay for it if this implies that, so that's a problem. But we've been looking more at removing mandates than adding them. So at this point, I haven't focused on that, and would like to learn more about it.
Okay. So Pat, you've pointed out again a number of reasons why teachers are struggling, lack of help with technology. But I'm thinking today of some of the younger teachers who come really ready. I mean, they know they're adopters, and what can be done to encourage them, despite all the obstacles that we've talked about? They're anxious to do it, and no doubt frustrated if they won't be able to in some fashion.
Thank you for bringing that up. As one of the antiquated who doesn't have a lot of background, it's not that I don't want, okay? I actually work with a number of younger teachers that I have mentored, and one of the things that, and I think it goes back to what is being addressed here, if you give a little bit back to local control, you're able to take care of some of these issues. One of our younger teachers who was recently selected as our region's secondary high school teacher of the year. He's been in the classroom now 8 years, and the technology that he brings into that classroom is I'm in awe. I've asked him, and he actually helps me a little bit, and I've been able to bring some of it into my classroom thanks to his help. Now, unfortunately, this should be something that I am being taught not by a fellow teacher, but on an ongoing basis in the way of staff development, but that's not the case. I think what we need to be able to do is allow our younger teachers to absolutely pursue what works best for them and the connections they can make with their kids. The comment I do want to make, though, in his acceptance speech for his award, the one thing that he said that he learned was the fact that what can never be replaced is interaction between teacher and student. And he said when he started, he relied so much on technology, he did not have that. And it was through working with his fellow teachers that it was brought to his attention, and that has made all of the difference in where he's going now. So I don't think that you have to halt the growth of our younger students and what they have access to and knowledge of in technology. I think we all learn from each other, and I think we've got to find ways, and that's what this idea of policy. Policy has got to be able to find ways in which we can blend the best of all of these worlds and make it workable and usable so that our students are the winners in this whole thing.
Yeah, Jerry, did you?
Well, you know, I know I said I was going to be optimistic and things, but I guess I have too much of my old self in me. You know, the other reason, just to follow on what Pat said, that we can't rely exclusively on these young teachers to bring technology into the classroom is that, unfortunately, in recent years, those young teachers are exactly the teachers that we've been handing pink slips to every year because of the budget problems that we're facing in the state. And you know, I've had a very real fear, you know, over these last 4 or 5 years that we're effectively losing most of a generation of teachers, you know, because of this, and that those teachers, especially ones that do have the technology skills, you know, may go elsewhere and, you know, look for additional careers. So, you know, I think Pat's exactly right. We can't just rely on those new young teachers because not all of them may be there. We have to also figure out how to provide the professional development up the ranks to all of the teachers.
All right. So we all know our money difficulties the state's facing, and I've seen, you know, a couple writers on the blog come back and continue to say Common Core is going to be $1.6 billion by various estimates. And so I'm wondering whether technology here, via the tools, particularly for professional development, using network and otherwise, and textbooks, digital textbooks, one market for 40-some states, whether or not that's too pessimistic. Does anyone have thoughts whether, in fact, technology can cut some of those costs and aid in this?
Yeah, I think I've never really seen good analyses of the cost savings that might come from technology, for example, for professional development, picking up on Jerry's theme. We know some of the vendors here today can do it. The old model was gathering people at some site and physically, not using much technology. So I think the area of developing professional development for middle grades mathematics, which is our topic today, through technology and doing that in a way that's more cost effective than we've done it in the past, could significantly cut those estimates of installing, if you will, the Common Core, because those are really based, I think, on different models of how you deliver it. So that would be a very important forefront for people to work in and show us how we can do that with our teaching force. Any other thoughts on that question? Jerry.
Well, the one thing that I would add is I mentioned AB 250, a bill that was enacted last year, and one small part of that was to start to establish a framework for developing professional development related to the Common Core standards. And the model in mind, there was a little bit of federal funds, you know, $3 or $4 million, I think, that was put there. That doesn't sound like much, and it's not much in terms of old professional development models, but I think what Mike's talking about in terms of using technology, developing modules for kind of self-professional development and things is part of what the vision was there.
Okay. Thank you. I guess one last question is an interesting framing here. And and is, will technology become the overseer, and I guess I'd say overlord, more than the humanistic application itself? And then there's a reference, hello, Hal, and I think that's, I don't know if that's a shout out to someone in the audience or a cultural reference. I think it's a cultural reference. So, Rick, you particularly, you've had a lot of experience with this. Are you concerned about technology, becoming dominant and overlooking the other aspects?
I think that's the fear, and that's why I tried to mention that in my comments, that I think we have to be very, very clear. This has to be about the learning. Clearly, a teacher is very critical in that, but this is a great tool. And to deny the use of the tool makes no sense at all, and yet we've kind of been in that space for a variety of reasons, budgetary, and I understand that, as well as some other restrictions that we have, but we've got to get clear about, no, this has to be about the learning, has to be about the teacher, but we have very capable people, at least that's been our experience in our district. And so I would put right up in front, no, this is about the learning, and yes, there are tools, just like any other tool. And, at one point back when I started my career, there was something called a calculator that kind of came to being, could we actually use those in the classroom? And there were a lot of debates, and does every kid get one? I mean, we went through all that stuff. And this is the same kind of issue to some degree. Are we going to adapt to the learning tools that are available? And the other thing that I would add is Larry Rosen, I think he's with CSU Dominguez Hills, he argues that actually the word tool is probably the wrong word for us to use. Our kids think about it as error. That's the way life is. And we, again, have not adapted well to that in schools, and so we kind of deny them air, if you will, when they come to school, and we need to get over that and expand out and say, you can learn all day, all night, and you can also learn during third period. I mean, all those pieces work. How do we integrate all those pieces together?
Pat, I will let the teacher have the final word here.
I smile with that. I don't necessarily, disagree. My only disagreement with you is your use of calculator. I remember the slide rule.
I have 3 versions of that.
I have one in my classroom, and my students are always asking me, what is that? And so I demonstrate, and they're in awe. I think that is the fine line that we walk. We've got to, and I continue to stress this, we've got to find a way in which we do implement technology and it becomes a partner in our classrooms, and that it's a daunting task that we face, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. I think that working together, and we continue conferences like this, and we begin to network outside of here. I'm from North Bay, and it's like, wow, this is great stuff. So, and I've met a number of people here today that I can take back, but this is what we have to continue to do, and I think stress the fact that we've got to find a way that we can implement technology and make it, as I continue to say, a partner, and not something that we say we can't do because we don't have the money. We say we can't do because I'm not getting the professional development. We've got to find ways in which we do it and we make it meaningful. And again, I stress this point. It has to be sustainable. We can't do this one-time hit. That's the problem that we've been facing for too many years now.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Pat. And let us all thank our panelists for their insightful comments.